All right, what's going on, everybody? I know it's been a while, but I'm back with a new video about how I built my first mechanical keyboard. So I'm going to talk you through sort of my process, everything that I did. So I'll go ahead and talk you through the parts, and then we can get into the building process, and then I'll talk a little bit about each of those steps, sort of what I thought and how I felt about it at the end. So enjoy. So like I said earlier, very first thing I want to talk about is the parts I used to build this keyboard. So I got everything in this build from two different places. I got it from kbdfans.com as well as Novel Keys. And I will specify what I got from where, and you can check all the links in the description for every item that I got and where I got it. So the very first thing, I got the Tofu 60 case. So this is a 60% keyboard, meaning it has no numpad, no function row, but for gaming, this is all I needed. For my PCB, I got the DZ60 RGB ANSI hot swap PCB, which means that the switches can be replaced if I want them to be in the future. And this layout just seemed to work the best for me. For my switches, I went with Kale Speed Dark Yellows because I wanted a speed switch, but I didn't want to end up with accidental presses, so the dark yellow is a good bit heavier than the speed silvers that Kale makes. I also went with a brass plate for my keyboard because I read a lot about how the brass plate sort of creates a more musical sound whenever those keys bottom out, and that was something that sounded appealing to me. And for my keycaps, I went with the Novel Keys PBOW, or purple and blue on white, mostly because I like the style. This is really the item that I started with whenever I was working on this keyboard. I saw these keycaps and I was like, yes, I want to build something around this. And so this is what I went with. And then just a couple of extra things. I also got a key switch separator so that I can pull apart my keycaps to lubricate, as well as a set of tools including a stem holder for my switch stems. And for switch lube, I went with Krytox 205 grade 0. You can go with any other lube for your own build. This is just what I chose for mine. Whenever I bought my parts for my keyboard, I ended up getting a DIY kit from KBD Fans that included that case, the PCB, the plate, as well as some stabilizers. It just allowed me to get everything in one place so that I knew everything would work together. So a disclaimer before we get into any of the building process, I'm very new to this, so there's a really good chance that I did stuff wrong. So if you're really looking for tutorials, everything that I used, I will link in the description. My go-to person was Taeha Types. I found that his videos, especially explaining lubing my switches, was incredibly helpful for me, so I definitely recommend that you check that out. Again, I'll have that linked in the description, but just keep in mind before we start into this, I'm new to this. I'll talk you through everything that I did, but this is just my experience. So the very first thing I did before I could even start putting things together was lubricate my switches. So because I had Kale style switches, on my switch separator, there are two separate places to put switches. With the Kale switches, you have to use the one that is the long flat piece as opposed to the 4 pegs, which are for cherry style switches. Now, I found that I had to put that switch on those metal prongs, just a bit of an angle to make sure that both of those metal pieces could get up under each side of the switch. Once I was able to do that, you just push down on the stem and the switch comes apart into its 4 parts. So you should have the top housing, the stem, the spring, and the bottom housing. So I started with just a little bit of lube on my brush and put about half of it on one of the rails on the inside of the bottom housing, and then the rest of it on the other half, and then evenly spread it out to make sure that there was nothing but a clear sheen on each side, and then took the remaining lube on my brush and gently rubbed it against the 2 bumps on the leaf of the switch. I then picked up the spring and took a generous amount of lube and rubbed it up on both the inside and the outside of the spring where the coil is pressed together. Once I was done with that, I put that lubed end of the spring into the bottom housing. Again, make sure the lubed end goes into the housing, leaving the unlubed end sticking up. Then I repeated that same process that I did on the bottom end of the spring for the other end. From there, I picked up the stem using my stem holder so that stem holder grabs onto the crucifix of the switch stem. I then took a small amount of lube and put it on one side of the switch, and then put the rest on the other. And then I gently brushed my brush across the two wide faces of the switch. I then started on one side of the switch, evenly rubbed in that amount of lube that I added, making sure to get in all of those crevices, did wide brush strokes on some of those wider ends, flipped to the other small end, repeated that same process, making sure to get into those grooves and along the top, and then finished off by painting the last little bit of lube onto that other long flat end, making sure to also get the legs of the switch. From there, I put the stem back onto the spring, making sure that the legs of the switch were facing the leaf of the bottom housing. And then I took my top housing, making sure to line up that gap at the bottom with the gap on the other part of the bottom housing, and then pushed it all together until I heard a nice click. I then just depressed the switch a few times to make sure that the lube was spread around a little bit and made sure that I didn't hear any extra scratching noises or anything like that, and then I was done. All I had to do was repeat this 60 more times for a total of 61 switches for this entire keyboard. This only took me about 5 or so hours to complete, which feels like it's a long time, but the difference in sound and smoothness of the switches was more than worth it for me. I also ended up buying 90 switches. Whenever I bought my switches, I felt as though I wanted to have enough switches in case I decided to add an external number pad or something like that with the same style of switches. I could always add that on later and have plenty of switches left over. I then worked on modifying my stabilizers. Now, for these MX style stabilizers, it is advised to cut off the 2 extra feet on the stabilizers so that they do end up contacting the PCB in more of a flat way as opposed to a bouncy way, which is to help with the overall feeling and sound of the stabilizer. For this, I just identified those 2 feet. They're the ones with the extra prongs sticking up off of them. I then took a flat wire cutter that's often used in jewelry making or something like that, as long as it has a flat end of the blade, lined that flat end up with that part of the leg of the stabilizer, snipped off each one, and then as you can see, it lays flat now. From there, I took the outer housing of the stabilizer and applied just a little bit of lube on each side of the stabilizer, as well as that back end where there's no hole, making sure to evenly spread it, again lubricating until I just saw a light sheen as opposed to any whiteness of the lube. I then took my stabilizer wires and put a large amount of lube on each one, making sure to move around that angled bend just a little bit. I then inserted the inner housing into the outer housing of the stabilizer, making sure that the 2 holes on the inner side lined up with the single hole on the outer side. Took my wire, inserted it into what was now the bottom for me, so the opposite end of the stem of the stabilizer, inserted my wire into that hole, and then clicked them into place on each side. From here, I installed the stabilizers on my PCB, which I originally did wrong. I forgot to use the included washers just to make sure that you avoid any shorts or contact with the screws on the PCB, so don't forget to do that like I did originally. I had to undo all the stabilizers I had just put in and do them all again. The PCB that I picked specifically didn't allow me to put the stabilizers in anywhere else other than their specific places, so for me as a beginner, this made it really easy for installing the stabilizers. Then I was able to take my plate and my switches and start installing everything onto the PCB. I started with just a few switches in spread out areas on the board just to make sure that the plate would stay stable. I also did end up getting a piece of foam for between my plate and my PCB, which helped greatly with making sure the spacing stayed. If you don't have the foam on your PCB, you have to make sure that the plate and the PCB have a little bit of distance between them and that the switches are snapped into the plate. After I was done with those corners, just making sure that everything lined up nicely, I was able to go ahead and put in the rest of my switches. I was then able to put my PCB plate switch combo into my case. I also did end up getting a piece of foam for inside the case that goes between the PCB and the case, This is also another optional thing. All the foam is optional. It's supposed to help absorb sound. I felt as though this was something I wanted because my goal of my build was to have a quiet gaming keyboard. So once I did that, I had a little bit of trouble with the foam, trying to get it to stay lined up with the back of the PCB, but what I found is that just laying it in the case the proper way and then inserting the PCB worked for me, screwed everything down, and I was good to go. Now at this point, before installing my keycaps, I decided to plug my keyboard into my computer just to make sure that everything worked. I opened up a keyboard testing website, touched all my switches just to make sure that everything showed up. So I went through each switch, making sure to touch it, and it popped up as to what it should. And then I went ahead and installed my keycaps. And then that's it. I'm done. I finished it. Now let's go ahead and get a little bit of a sound test before I jump into talking about sort of how I feel about the entire experience and how I feel about this keyboard specifically. So overall, I'm really satisfied with how this came out. I love the look, I love the sound, I love the way it feels. It's definitely not ideal for typing, but I think it works really well for gaming. I end up with those nice, smooth, linear presses that I was looking for without having any of those accidental presses, especially with heavy speed switches. I definitely think that that worked out very well for what I was looking for. Overall, I probably put about 7 or so hours from start to finish building this keyboard. I did do the switches in 2 different sessions, so about 2 or 3 hours. I just threw on some YouTube, was lubing switches. At a certain point, I got really used to it. As I was going through, I didn't really have to pay too close of attention to what I was doing, kind of allowed me to do other things at the same time. This also cost me about $400 to build. Definitely expensive for a keyboard, but again, it was very specific for what I wanted, and it also allowed me to sort of work on something new that I'd never done before. I definitely recommend building your own keyboard to anybody who's interested in it. If you have any interest in it at all, I recommend just go for it. There are plenty of cheaper options that work for people. I opted for a lot of metal parts. There are definitely plastic parts or other things that you can get that do help bring down that cost. It's all personal preference, budget friendly, everything like that. One thing I forgot to add is that I recently moved to a new house, which is great. However, our internet here is terrible, and that's why I've been unable to stream recently. I wish I could continue with that, and hopefully in the future I will be able to. So you can follow me over at twitch.tv/Jakob Schall if you're interested. I don't currently stream there, but I really hope to in the future. So thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. Hopefully I will be back much sooner than I was last time with some new videos. I have some ideas in my head. Let me know down in the comments also what you'd like to see, and leave a like on this video if you liked it. It really helps me out. If you're not subscribed already, please do so, and I will see you all next time. Peace out.